Well, hello and welcome back. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about joints and what goes into those. So a joint is just like a constraint. It's the exact same concept. You've got your types, selections, solution sets, offsets, the ability to add limits if needed. But it achieves it a little more effectively. I think that one day constraints probably won't exist. We'll probably use solely joints because you're pretty much going to add more relationships with less joints needed. So, looking at it, you've still got your selection sets. The icons are a little different, but it's the same concept. You can also flip positions, kind of like you would in sheet metal commands. A lot of those things. You can also align it and then flip from the alignment as well. And then you've still got the offset and a series of selections, although now it's in a drop down. Also, the limits are here too. It's a little more effective here as well, though. You can do an angular as well as linear, and it'll even show the current position. So it's pretty cool, dialog box in itself. But there's a few cooler things about it. So say I were to choose 2 cylinders, and mind you, this is a fully constrained part, so it's probably going to have some adverse effects when I do this, but if I choose 2 cylinders, you can see it actually shows them moving in position. This is what the joint's doing, and I can hit play here. This just has the automatic playing turned on, but if I hit this, again, you can see what it's going to do. And if you notice, when I did the selections at the beginning of this, I had automatic turned on. That's what it defaults to, but it'll pick what constraint set you need, or joint set, I should say, which is nice. So, if I turn it back on, it's always going to default to automatic. But once I choose 2 things, it's not going to have, automatic listed. So you would then have to hit escape and turn joint back on. But yeah, it's pretty cool. It allows you a lot more control with a lot less effort. And I'm just going to play around and kind of show off each of those joints here for you. Let me delete everything. And for the heck of it, I'll ground this. Obviously, I don't suggest doing that, but just so I can put joints on one piece that doesn't move, I'll show you kind of how to go about that. So, first up is rigid. Now, rigid is meant for when you have a part that is fixed. Essentially, this is kind of similar to grounding, although a little more acceptable. So basically, you would probably use rigid in a case like where you have maybe some welded components where something's going to be set in stone. It's never going to move. It's a rigid body touching another rigid body. So like in this case, this part, I wouldn't really probably use it in this constraint at all or in this assembly at all. But if I wanted this to constantly be stuck in this flat hole over here, I could add rigid. And as you can see, it kind of shows the effect of if you were to tug on something and it was literally, forever fixed there. It shows like the struggle, the motion. That's what you would get. So now this part, if I were to have grounded this one as well. So now this doesn't move. So if I were to tug on this one that has a rigid connection to this one, it won't move at all. No spinning, no movement, nothing. Which is, obviously okay in some cases. I'm just going to undo this. Okay, so next up we have rotational. Now rotational is going to act most like an insert command. So if I just chose like you would with the insert, a circular edge and a circular edge, which I actually misclicked there. If I chose those two, now you'll see it can freely spin, but it's connected right there. Essentially what it's doing is it's applying an axial constraint from axis to other axis, as well as a mate from edge to edge, like an insert. There's a few more caveats with it though. If I were to go back and, undo it basically. When you're hovering over a selection area, like the cylinder for instance, you can kind of see it's highlighting a lot. There's a lot of context info happening here. Now on the ends, you can see there's an edge and a point. And essentially all it's doing is showing this is a cylinder. I'm selecting the full cylindrical body. And then you can see this little node right here. And that's what I'm going to call that. It probably is a node, but I don't really know for sure. If I hover on the end, that node moves. In fact, it'll stay there until I'm exactly past halfway, and then it switches to the other side, which is here. Same with this end. If I just move to like right here, you can see, technically it's going to select this cylindrical body, but the end of it. Now the same could be said, for this, same deal. And that goes with faces as well. This is going to be your general selection style, where you're hovering, like in this case, on a face, and it'll let me choose the node there. So what this allows you to do, this node, is it allows you to give greater control over the part. So if I were to say choose the cylindrical body, but the end of the thread, and then I'm just going to choose the end of this cylinder, but the end of here, the thread will stop exactly right there at the beginning of the part. And then I could freely spin it as I needed. Now this one definitely has its use cases, and I would imagine the more you play around with these joint constraints and can figure out, what you're going to use them for, you'll probably use this one a ton. Up next is slider. Now I really don't have a good use case for slider here. If you look at the little thumbnail, which these all are pretty indicative of what they do, the slider is meant for, like a keyway, something where you have a square shape sliding upon or through another square shape. So I don't have that. So what I'm going to do is show you the use case I have for it, which is basically to make this jaw function like an actual jaw. Obviously that these two should be able to pinch in towards each other and away from each other. And the way I can achieve that is less than ideal. So when you're hovering over a face, I mentioned it would show the nodes, but you can also hover on a object with a sketch like this or a shape like this. You can hover on the midpoints, the corner points, and so on. So I'm going to hover over the face, and then this little endpoint here. And unfortunately, I forgot. So the first one, the first solution set item, that's going to be the part that moves towards the other part. So since this one is grounded, I want to choose this selection second. So I'm going to choose this part, the same corresponding location, and then I'll choose this one's corresponding location, and as you see, it does this. Now that's okay. Basically, if you look closely though, you can see it took the same 2 points and it put them with the arrows facing the same direction. Kind of makes sense when you're thinking about it, but there's ways to manipulate that. And in this case, I'm going to use align. So I'm going to choose the 2 interfaces. So I'll choose this one, and then I'll choose this one. Now it's the same exact look, but I can go through and flip both of these columns here, and it'll make it look right. So now you can a little better see, we chose these points here. This one on this face is pointing in that direction, and this one on this face is pointing that direction. So we know that they're going to move in that relationship to each other. Now I could put in a gap, and this is, all of the joints allow you to do this, but I could put in 4 inches. And in this case, because we chose the top faces, it's going to move 4 inches up. So it wouldn't really work for this for insert or the rotational. It works great. But for here, we're just going to make sure that it stays 0. But we can just simply hit play and see what it does. And as you can imagine, they move in and out. Now, obviously, you wouldn't want it to cut through this face, and that's where limits would come in. You could apply a, let's just put in a limit. Let's see. So it's currently at 0, obviously. We could put like negative. Well, actually, we would want that one to be 0. So I'm going to uncheck start. Change this one to 4. Let's see what that does. So you can kind of see a projection of what it'll allow you to do. But now, it still slid through there. So let's actually edit that, and let's put in a start limit too. I bet you that's all we need to do. So now, just like that, you could simulate a real moving jaw because it starts here and ends there. So there's a lot of control in these joints, and as you saw, it was pretty easy to simulate that. You didn't have to use contact solver. It was a lot easier to edit than, say, a constraint. But yeah, pretty good use case. And then, if you decided you didn't want the limits anymore, you could always just uncheck that. It's cool to have, but technically you could achieve the same effect where it stops with just using other constraints. But, it's just cool to know what you can do. You may find a way to actually apply this to something later on. Okay, so next up, cylindrical. So we already talked about it. So say we went back to the same spot where we did the rotational. I'll show you the difference. I'm going to choose the same nodes. And then the difference is, as you can see, it's essentially like applying an axial constraint. The part can still spin. It's hard to tell, but it is spinning. But it allows it to move along this path. So obviously a lot of times you're probably going to use rotational instead. But say you wanted a quote-unquote axis constraint, mating two axes together, this is what this would achieve, the same exact concept. Pretty straightforward. Okay. Let's see. So next up is planar. Now planar, you may be able to tell by the picture, but what it's showing, so imagine you had a box sitting on the floor. That box would not on its own be able to move up and down. You would have to break gravity, right? That's kind of what planar is conceptualizing in that thumbnail. Basically, you are going to make it where a part is constrained to a part like a mate, but can still shift freely in any direction besides up and down. So, in this case, for instance, right now, we have, this part is locked in place and this one's not. So, I could do a joint with a planar on. Choose maybe the top center. This top center. And, it does like this goofy little preview here. But I should be able to hit flip. And now, it's going to stay aligned with it just like that. It's kind of hard to see when you get, tugging it out in space, but basically you could apply a couple of these pretty quickly. Oh yeah, okay, so I did that backwards again, I think. So let's just do the top middle again. How about that? It's a safe spot. Okay, so now the reason it prompted that dialog box, this is one thing you do have to watch out for. Even if you change it from automatic and you choose which one you want, it'll try to predict it still. So if you notice, it changed to rigid. So that's the problem here. So I'm going to put that back on planar. And clearly, I want these to be flush so they're in line with each other. So I'm just going to hit that flip. And now we've got that movement in between. So now you could go back through like I was doing earlier and put that, what was it, slider? Yeah, slider position on it. And we could have a full-on, part just like that too. Or you could just put a constraint, in between these using the same thing. You could do, a lot of different things in order to get that same end. So it's cool to know that these are there though. Obviously, it's a little more work hovering over the right positions here with the nodes, but once you get used to it, it's not too bad. And it does allow you a pretty good bit of control. And you don't lose anything by doing this. Now, I haven't played around with these enough to know, like clearly you're probably thinking, where's symmetry? Where's tangent? The answer is, there is none, but I bet you that you can get by without it using these. Maybe with automatic. Now, ball possibly could help, but I doubt it. That's the only one that's focused on really, tangent style stuff, and I'll show it next. But for it, unfortunately, the ball is very unique, so you really can only show it in a ball joint. Now, like your, I guess you'd say like your pelvis, you have a socket going into a round, concave shape in order to allow it to move freely. And that's kind of what's happening with a part like this. So, using a joint, I was actually able to achieve, this is a gyroscope, and I was able to achieve its real function, which is to be able to spin freely and to move to an extent around while staying in the joint. Now, I've played around, and you cannot perfectly replicate this using constraints. So if nothing else from joints, if you ever have to make a ball joint style thing, you're going to have to use joints. In this case, like if you look, I have a limit. I use contact solver, and it allows this part to not go past the area that it's supposed to. Now it'll jump for a minute, it'll let you, but it'll fling out when you let go. So, like in that case. And this was achieved using contact solver to find a value and then putting in a limit, basically. But the joint is the real, the big part here. That's what's basically keeping it in position. And as you can tell, what I did was I chose the mid plane of this ball, and then I chose the top of the actual cylindrical part, which the center mark is up here actually, so that's why it's showing way up here. And yeah, it's pretty cool tool. Let me show you like a section view so you can see kind of what's really happening here. So basically, this ball is actually spinning inside of this perfect arc, and it's maintaining its rough position to this hole. It's a really cool thing, and like I said, you're definitely not going to be able to recreate that with planes, a series of axes, points, constraints, nothing. Ball joint. And it's super easy. I'm going to turn off this section view and I'll kind of show you how it works, but it is really straightforward as well, of course. Okay, so all you do is choose, in this case, if I were to choose a different area, it'll actually work for pretty much anything. Even though this is different inputs, I can still choose that same thing. And as you can see, it simulates how the ball would work. And just like that, bam, stays fit in there. I mean, 2 clicks to make something that you would struggle for hours, days to set up right, it's pretty cool. But yeah, that's pretty much it with these, if you're ever wondering about what they can do, don't forget you can always hover and hit F1 to see more. But I'm pretty sure this is the future, so get on board. All right, thanks for watching, everybody.